Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of Jay Shah, Head Cultural Outreach Mahindra & Mahindra, Sanjoy Roy, Managing Director Teamwork Arts, and my other colleagues at Meta Secretariat, I would like to welcome you back to the first virtual Meta. Mahindra Excellence in Theatre Awards 2020 is celebrating its 15th landmark edition with a first of its kind virtual award ceremony on August 30th. The ceremony will feature an online event with leading theatre personalities, including past and present nominees and Meta awardees. The lead up to the Mahindra Excellence in Theatre Awards 2020 includes a 3-week-long celebration with a Theatre Critics Conference today, followed by the launch of the first ever published edition of the Meta Best Original Script on August 18th, and a tribute for the Meta 2020 Lifetime Achievement Awardee, Barry John, on August 23rd, and culminating in a pioneering virtual awards ceremony on August 30th. In today's Theatre Critics Conference, we had two wonderful sessions on the impact and state of theatre in India during COVID-19 and censorship and self-censorship. In case you missed out on those sessions, you can log on to our Facebook and YouTube channels and see it in the archives. Our session for today is The Need for Critics. Our panelists, Ananda, Deepa Gahlot, Gayatri, Sinha, Mayank Shankar, and moderated by Mukund Padmanabhan. Ananda started practicing theatre hands-on with Kolkata-based group, The Red Curtain, in 1973. A graduate of Presidency College and the University of Calcutta, he soon realized his fascination for the art form and went to do a PhD in theatre from the University of Illinois, USA. Upon his return to Kolkata, he started working at Jadavpur University, from where he retired in 2017 as Professor of English. At Jadavpur, Professor Lal taught drama and introduced a practical theatre course in which he directed students for public performances every year for 25 years. In 1978, Ananda began writing on theatre for the Kolkata newspaper, The Hindustan Standard, as a theatre critic of The Telegraph 1986 to 2018, and now of the important books include Rabindranath Tagore, 3 plays, the first English book exclusively on Tagorean drama, Rasa, the Indian Performing Arts, the Shakespeare on the Calcutta stage, the Oxford Companion to Indian Theatre, Twist in the Folk Tale, 3 plays, Theatre of India, and Indian Drama in English. He also wrote the teleplay of 9-episode serial on 200 years of Bengali theatre for Doordarshan and translated into English plays by Tagore and Utkal Dutt. Our next panelist, Deepa Gahlot. Deepa Gahlot is a journalist, critic, columnist, editor, blogger, author, and curator. She writes extensively on cinema, theatre, the arts, women's issues for several publications and websites. She has won the National Award for Best Film, Criticism, edited several cinema journals. Her work has appeared in anthologies on women's studies and cinema, Bollywood popular Indian cinema, behind the scenes of Indian Hindi cinema, a visual journey through the heart of Bollywood, and Janani. She has also worked on numerous books, including the Prithviwalas and biographies of Shah Rukh Khan and Shami Kapoor. She also headed the theatre and film department of the National Centre for the Performing Arts, Mumbai, for 7 years. Our next panelist, Gayatri Sinha. Gayatri Sinha is an editor, art critic, and curator based in New Delhi. She is the founder-director of Critical Collective, an initiative for communication in the arts. She has edited a number of theatre titles, including Voice of Change, 20 Indian Artists, Art and Visual Culture in India, Indian Art, an overview, Women Goddess, Expressions and Evocations, which was in 1996. Gayatri has curated extensively in India and abroad, including at the museums in Belgium, Kiran Nadar Museum of Art, Indian Art Fair, and Korean International Art Fair, among many others. For leading private galleries like Sakshi, Space, and Vadhera Art Gallery, and institutions like Birla Academy, she has addressed issues on the state of Indian polity in the period of violence and flux. As an art critic, she has written a column for the Indian Express and the Hindu, and has worked on monographs on the artists Krishna Khanna, Adi Moolam, and Himmat Shah. Our next panelist, Mayank Shekhar. Mayank Shekhar is a film critic, writer, and journalist. His work as a cinema curator includes the Jagran Film Festival and the Kala Ghoda Arts Festival. He's been on several film juries, including Mami and national awards. A part of the founding editorial team of Mumbai Mirror, Mayank has written extensively for it as well as for Hindustan Times, where he served as national culture editor. He was the first film critic to receive the Ramnath Goenka Award for Excellence in Journalism in 2006, and was chosen among emerging film critics from across the world at the Berlin Film Festival in 2008. Mayank is currently the entertainment head at Midday. Our moderator for the session today, Mukund Padmanabhan. Mukund Padmanabhan is a professor of practice at the newly established Kriya University, where he teaches philosophy and related subjects. He has been the editor of The Hindu and its sister publication, The Hindu Business Line. A journalist for most of his working life, Mukund is an MPhil in philosophy and worked briefly as a lecturer in the University of Delhi before switching to journalism. He was an adjunct faculty of the Ateneo de Manila University in the Philippines, where he taught law and advanced writing to postgraduate students. For the Hindu group, he has curated 2 festivals of theatre and music, the Hindu Theatre Fest and the Hindu November Fest. He also works on an annual thought conclave on behalf of the newspaper called The Huddle. He's on the board of trustees for the CPB Foundation, which organizes the Chennai Photo Biennale. Mukund, over to you.
Thank you, Suraj, and thank you, Sanjay. I'm struck every time I have an association with Meta how much you guys are doing for theatre and how much you're doing to support this. Straight away I was struck by the title of the session, which is the need for critics, and the need suggests, by implication, a lack of something, if not a complete absence. So maybe the title is a good place to start and kick off this conversation. In India, as in many parts of the world actually, there's been a marked decline in the media coverage of theatre and the arts in general. Theatre critics, like other forms of art criticism or even coverage of the arts, is increasingly regarded as something of an elitist occupation, a form of free publicity, or sometimes even as an activity that could create, dissonance and upset in the community and so on. So my question, and I'll start with you, Gayatri, is do theatre critics, like other art critics, inhabit an extremely marginalized space in society today? And if so, why?
Thank you, Mukund, and thank you, Meta, for having me on this panel. This is like a return to an earlier avatar where I was very engaged with theatre and theatre criticism earlier, but now spend much of my time with art criticism. And I'm delighted to see there are at least 2 film critics on this panel because of the synergies between the arts and the fact that criticism is really something like an umbrella discipline. Yes, it's horribly marginalized. There's no doubt about it, because if we see the chain of patron, consumer, artist, production houses, etc., the critic is the weakest link in the chain. And oddly enough, when the market forces become dominant, or if there is a terrible decline in the market, with both extremes, the link that just falls or dissolves is really the link of the critic. They are poorly paid, and they're not seen as very important. If you look at a lot of critical writing or writing on criticism from the early part of this century, it's about the loss of the critic. And why has this happened? It's also because curators have become extremely powerful. Art curators, we can speak about art, or we can speak about festival curators, we can speak about curators of theatre or photography biennials, etc. Curator has become the dominant writer in the critical discourse. The critic has sort of slumped. He or she is not seen as material. But this is, I think, a great loss. So I actually set up Critical Collective about 5 years ago to give a voice to critical writing as much as possible. And what does the critic do? The critic enables an archive. The critic enables a documentation. If we look at the person who occupied the space of art and theatre with great grandeur through much of the 20th century, Ibrahim Al-Qazi, who died a few days ago, he actually played both of these roles. So he understood that the cusp of pedagogy is which can divert into criticism, and it can divert into production and performance. And he did this very well, because while he ran an art gallery, he brought out an art critical journal called Art Heritage, and while he produced plays and performed his role as director, he was also a pedagogue. So I think this sort of umbrella discipline of teaching, of performance, of criticism, and of viewership, these are all deeply intertwined. And to take one out of the system is to greatly weaken it. I hear you, Mukund.
Mukund, you're on mute.
Sorry, Ananda, I'm going to turn this question over to you. I know you're engaged in archiving and documentation, and there are many roles you play in connection to the theatre. So we were asking the question on the marginalization of the theatre critic. And interestingly, I looked at Wikipedia for a list of Indian theatre critics. It mentions 7, and you're one of them. So that's not a large number, but that Wiki may not be a representation of what's actually happening across the nation. But still, are you a sort of a threatened species? Do you feel like a part of one?
Oh yeah, absolutely, Mukund, because I mean, if you look at the space that is given to theatre criticism, it's virtually gone everywhere. If you think of media in 3 different categories, there is no theatre criticism to speak of online. Basically, there is actually very little, and there is really no platform online for theatre as such. So therefore, there is no platform for theatre criticism. A lot of bloggers exist, but that's really not theatre critics. If you look at television, again, the same thing happens. There's so much coverage for film, but of course, there is no such space for theatre. And if you look at the print media, where the theatre critic used to stay, used to inhabit, you find that whereas in New York or in London, the New York Times and the London Times continue to have brilliant theatre criticism, we in India feel that it is obviously a soft story, as you pointed out already, Gayatri and Mukund. Therefore, it doesn't deserve any space-worthy. So what's going on is that most of the newspapers have stopped theatre criticism. They don't cover that anymore. The space has definitely declined to the point of virtually extinction. Secondly, you have to think in terms of what exactly are the spatial parameters that we do get as theatre critics. I mean, in my own experience over nearly 40 years, the space has declined. Although I used to have a regular column, that column began maybe with 600 or 700 words, and now you are not expected to write more than 300 or 350 maximum. So that's additional pressure, obviously, on us. And a lot of space has actually been taken over by previews, which of course is now, it's almost kind of, the artist is accustomed to get a good positive preview of his or her work, and therefore gets very irritated when a critical review comes out. In my own experience, I've had eminent theatre people actually abuse me in print and on the phone for having written what they perceive to be a bad review of their work. Now, of course, the theatre critic has the right to criticize and to a certain extent has to be frank about things. Otherwise, they are not being true to the motto of the critic. In one instance, an event manager whom I had asked whether she wanted a review of a production that she was curating, said pretty much go to hell, because critics only say negative things, and therefore implied is that if we give you a complimentary ticket, you should give me or us a good review. Now this, of course, is ridiculous. And thirdly, the space is also shrinking because of the people in the few places that you do have theatre critics. The people who are chosen to be theatre critics know nothing about theatre. Usually it's the youngest sub-editor who has joined the outfit with, let's say, a degree, maybe at best a BA English Honours, who may not have any experience of either being in a theatre production or even watching a play, and they get to review. So that's the problem. We are, yes, more than the tiger, we are endangered.
Right. I'm going to just feed off of something you said and ask the question whether we as a people are kind of Indians, that is extra sensitive to criticism. I mean, do theater directors and actors just need to develop a slightly thicker skin? I find, and having been an editor of the paper, I've faced exactly the kind of issues that you have faced. People have come to me saying, how could your review have written this? But one of the things I found is that the use of irony and wit, particularly, which is a kind of staple in critiques in the West, is regarded as something that is hugely disrespectful and almost shameful. People are more tolerant if you say, okay, this performance was bad or substandard or so on. But if you invest that point in or wrap it in a sort of ironical way or a witty fashion, then they take real offense. So I think you flagged this dilemma, and there is this contradiction. There is this hunger, for instance, for reviews, but at the same time, it's very limited hunger. It's only for glowing good reviews. And so, yeah, I think the previews have become a kind of a safe kind of space that people want. But I want to ask you, Mayank, have you had people come up and say, yeah, I've read your critical remarks, but I respect what you have to say, and I think you have a point. I mean, not a reader, but say someone you have actually critiqued.
I mean, there are quite a few stories, to be honest with you. But
tell us some
will do.
Yeah.
Will do. But I mean, I think what we're really arriving at, Mukund, and which is the fundamental question that we were discussing in the first place, is the need for critics. Given that poor critics are discussing it, in itself becomes a self-serving proposition that we are ourselves talking about its need. And I think that genuinely comes from the fact that we are unable to see critics as a society, I feel, to a huge extent, even among creators to a large extent as well, as no different from a writer to begin with, or any other artist, because what is, even politics for that matter, what is all of it in some form but critique in their own ways. But to see criticism as a craft or an art form of its own, I think we're quite far away from that point, which has a lot to do with also the readers in terms of what they demand from the critic. It would be no different, I'm pretty sure, with theater criticism as it is for film criticism as well, because at the end of the day, they're very similar in the sense of both demand time and a place setting in terms of you having to go. I mean, I'm talking about the theater as it's always existed, not in the times of COVID, but it requires going to a particular place and an experience which lasts about 2 hours, 2.5 hours. It also requires theater by itself not being very different from film in the sense of it being an intersection of various art forms, say literature, intersection of performance art, sound, light, stagecraft, all those things, which is roughly the same with film, except there's far more technology added to that set that mix into cinema. So the response is roughly the same. I think there is crowdsourcing that's taken over ever since the post-internet criticism has always been like you crowdsourced the 7 people who are theater critics before coming into this. You went to Wikipedia, which is a user-generated bunch of people who are telling you there are 7 theater critics, which is roughly what people do when they go to watch a play or go watch a movie. They crowdsource what people are saying, and it boils down to those star ratings and things like that, which is the consumer rating. And then there is this idea built in the social media sphere that my opinion is as good as yours. So why are you a critic, right? And if all of us don't know anything, then I guess your opinion is as good as mine. And that's really where we reached. In terms of the creators or the community of artists, their relationship with criticism, I think it's never, ever going to be a happy one. And it's unfair to expect that to happen either. I mean, if I do not like a particular film or a particular play, I can't expect the person to have liked my review of it. It's the most emotional response that you're likely to have. And likewise, the opposite, where you're supposed to, you really like that critic who gave you a great review. automatically, and it just that fondness only stays until the point that he doesn't. Until then, he was very unbiased and very erudite and knows the craft, as it were. And then when it's reversed, it's just the opposite. And of course, especially when it becomes slightly incestuous environment like Bombay, where the film industry is here, and you as a journalist, because one of the jobs of a critic is also to be better informed than a casual viewer or reader or consumer, you engage far more with the practitioners of the craft through long form interviews, through spending time with them, trying to see build a context from the auteur approach, that side of it, which so much of journalism is. So that aspect you have to constantly sort of professionally be in constant touch, and then you will have situations where they stop talking to you, or they stop taking your messages, or they don't give you that interview.
Deepa, can you hear me? Hello?
Mukund, perhaps you should come back to Deepa because she's still trying to log on.
Yeah, so I'm going. I'm going to take off from an earlier point you made about the internet and so on. I think Ananda referred to it too. I mean, we've had a lot of discourse on how the coronavirus will trigger a sort of digital theatre revolution, and we already have examples of theatre groups moving their productions online and so on. But what is less talked about, at least in the public sphere, is that the impact of the internet and social media on criticism. We seem to be increasingly living in an environment where it's possible for audiences, from people who are lay to those who are informed, or even who are extremely erudite, post their views in blogs on Facebook and other social media platforms. I'm not sure I entirely agree with Ananda that between a mainstream cultural commentator and everyone else who's lay. I've read some very, very informed stuff on blogs as well, but we'll let that be. In this connection, I just want to say that, I'm guilty of having done this as well. I mean, one of the things I did for the Hindu for 15 years was to create, I probably still continue to do that, create a festival of theatre. And then the issue came about reviewing it. And if we reviewed it in the early years, and when the reviews were good, people just said, you're biased. I mean, you bring the show and then you're writing glowing stuff about your own show. This is terrible. And then when we criticized it, it was like, how can you do this? How can you run down something that you yourself are showcasing? So there was no winning here. So as a result of this, what we did was we simply outsourced this. We just announced that, the audience can critique these plays in so many words. Not a lot of words, Ananda, not 600. But we published, 10 reviews with a little incentive. And yeah, they varied in quality. Some of them were good. Some of them were not so good. There was a little incentive we gave. But I think my question is, from experience like this, is, has this role of a traditional theatre critic, one of a cultural expert, a sort of gatekeeper, we've talked of it being undermined. We've talked of it being undermined by newspapers. We've talked of it, Gayatri, of being undermined by festival curators. And I want to ask both Gayatri and Ananda this question. Do you think it's also been undermined by a digitally empowered public or a digitally empowered audience? You're muted.
Gayatri, you've muted yourself again. You need to unmute yourself. Yeah, that's fine.
All right. Is this okay?
Yes.
I'm listening to you, and the 2 or 3 things are going through my mind. I'm thinking of whether it isn't only the critic that is devalued, or whether it isn't the entire corpus of what we would have considered the figures of authority, or the voices of authority, or opinion formation. A Shamlal or a Girilal Jain writing an editorial was a figure of authority, and it carried great weight. The editors of today, Mukund, you would be in a great position to answer this a little better, but they are not quite the figures of such domination. They're not quite the figures of a pan-Indian sort of opinion formation. So, and I think that the organ, the newspaper or the magazine, is the one that has to confer the kind of power that, say, the Guardian might give to Jonathan Jones, who is maybe their art critic, or the New York Times gives to Holland Cotter, who's their art critic, and he gives this, you know, the amount of money that is invested in the travels of these critics to various parts of the world, the kind of space that's given. This would have been something that was still possible in India in the mid-90s, but mid-1990s, but thereafter we see this sort of devaluation that's taken place. The other thing is, I think, you know, one of the earlier questions you asked was that, is there something in the Indian mind? I mean, how do we respond? Is criticism something that is endemic? Is it something that is sui generis from the land of India? It's something that we have to understand, that we've had great theatre, we've had theatre for 2000 years, we've had it in multiple disciplines, we've had it in rural, urban, feudal, etc., other kinds of settings, similar with our practices, but have we had criticism? And the understanding that comes to my mind is that what we've had is something like commentaries. So irony and wit, perhaps, they do come in perhaps in certain kinds of theatre forms, like in the Vidushak will be the commentator on something. But did you have an outside critic being able to respond, and where would she or he, other than the 20th century, which is really the period of a kind of a colonial hangover of the newspaper, and of course the use of irony, wit, language skills, the authority with which a critic could write, that would have been the period where it was smack in. Now, to come to whether that was a digital, the digital response, I think this is a very interesting situation, because if the critic or the writer, the individual thinker, which is really what the critic is, because the critic doesn't even really represent a newspaper. He or she only represents themselves, their own thinking, their own research, their own study.
Absolutely.
They write for a bit. So I think what is important is, what does a person do in this? I think you actually are being compelled to treat alternative spaces. And in that sense, I think the blogger, it's seen as a sort of a partial, liminal or a marginal space. It can possibly grow into something else. The newspaper is not going to accord you more than 400 words. One left the Hindu also partially because of this, because from 2,000 words you came down to 400 words or something, and the picture grew bigger, the text grew smaller. These are things that, if you don't want the capitalist sort of presence of a large patron who determines everything, and or you don't have any other, look at the way who's presenting art, who's presenting theatre. For about 20 or 30 years, as long as one was seeing it, there were groups. Artist groups were putting up their own exhibitions, artist groups or theatre groups were putting up a lot of their own plays. That space has also shrunk. It is really the space of the larger, big patron who can afford to have a large festival and who promotes it. And thereafter, the individual critic seems to have shrunk even further in size in relationship to that, unless he or she is also given a space as a seminarian, as a curator of some kind or the other. So I think the push towards alternative spaces, towards other like-minded kinds of formations, which can be global. They needn't be just restricted to India. I think that kind of formation is really in process now, and we might see more and more of this.
Yeah, Ananda. Gayatri made the point about space and newspapers, which is fair, I think. Mm-hmm. But what technology has opened up is seamless amounts of space online. There is no reason why somebody with the right resources or the right mindset and the right energy can't set up a culture, a sort of art criticism website with enough space. So I understand, newspapers are bound by economics and newsprint prices and so on and so forth. But what the digital revolution has done, and this ironically happened at the time of the mid-90s, is open up seamless amounts of space to people.
Absolutely. I'm not at all saying that all that is available online is bad. That would be clearly too simplistic and generalized. In fact, again, from the same principles where drama criticism and all arts criticism began in the modern period across the world, it is actually the freedom of speech, of opinion, which you are getting online in exponentially huge numbers. So now everybody can become a theater critic. But the point that I am trying to make is that you use the word informed, right? Now there's, 70 to 80% of the blogs or the casual opinions or reactions that I get online are completely uninformed or misinformed, right? So that's the difference. And at the same time, of course, there is that small minority of people who may not necessarily be critics, but they clearly have a much deeper knowledge of what they saw and reaction to it. And so I respect that, absolutely. But at the same time, you talked about the spaces that, we can portals maybe, but where is the portal? It's been more than 15 years since the online has opened up. And where is the Indian portal that deals exclusively with, I'm not even talking about theater, with art? You would have expected Sangeet Natak Academy with its funding to have done something like this. But of course, ... you understand, what happens with institutions created by... but on the other hand, SNA actually, I don't know if you know this, they are running right now over the last 3 or 4 months, have got archived productions of theater productions that they're showing. So that's good in a certain sense, but we don't have a portal to speak of on arts and culture. And of course, there is this problem with the informed nature of criticism. By the way, everybody also knows that the kind of language that you get, whatever the language may be, English or Hindi or whatever, is sometimes on blogs or even casual commentary, is absolutely atrocious. So, I get put off, and other people will probably also get put off after reading 3 or 4 lines. I mean, who wants to read that? Who wants to waste my time on reading something like that? You can't just spout, as lots of people do online. You have to revise, you have to carefully construct arts criticism, and then only you post it. But that's not what happens. Everybody just kind of vents. So there is a problem in that, and that's where the editor was so important, so crucial, right, Mukund? Because editing is a craft of its own. The other thing that Gayatri mentioned in terms of the festivals, I would like to point out that there are many theatre cultures in India which have no access to festivals and which don't need festivals. Bangla theatre, for instance, in which I'm deeply rooted. There are literally every year there are 500, 600 theatre productions with no exposure to festivals. They are doing serious work. They are much more politically motivated, socially motivated than any other art form. I'm using these words very, very carefully because of reasons which later on I can explain. There is no money in theatre. So you are free to say exactly whatever it is that you want. And because it's such a soft space, so marginalized, the government is not interested in cracking down on it, which it will do with film. So, these are things that we should consider.
Mike, I mean, I see the tension that, that one might argue that there is a certain democratization.
Yeah.
But at the same time, there is a certain, lowering of standards. I think we've seen this all over in the internet, whether it's about, making political comments on Twitter or wherever. So I think that feature, is something that one can't dispute. But in my mind, nothing kind of exemplifies this marginalization, if you like, and then say this website called Rotten Tomatoes, which, anyone who's looked at the site knows that it evaluates films in 2 ways. One, it has an audience score, which is apparently a sort of verified audience, on the basis of verified audience reaction. And it has something it calls a tomato meter, which is derived from an aggregation of reviews.
Yeah.
Again, verified reviews by ostensibly, I mean, eminent critics, I'd imagine. So the thing is that even if you don't want to be led by the audience, you think the audience might, might not be the right, the right people to judge something. You might say that, look, if 80% of critics think that, Rotten Tomatoes have given it a good score, maybe this is a case for watching the film. But I think somewhere in this kind of aggregation, and I think this is what happens in this the web space, that what Mayank thinks of a film, or Gayatri thinks, or Ananda thinks of a film, or a production, gets lost. So, do you see this as a kind of problem, Mayank? That your voice, that your own voice, it gets lost because of this digital revolution?
But Mukund, I think just to briefly go back to what Gayatri said, and I hadn't thought of this before, the fact is that theater existed in our lives as a society from before newspapers did. And so people would have gone to watch a play. What did they do after that? I'm wondering for a second. Did they just talk to each other? Did they tell people? Did one person's opinion matter any more than the other person's? Because there was no platform for them to air it in the way that a newspaper brought like a critic on board. And I think eventually, if you just boil it down, it comes to writing actually. Criticism, whether in the arts or in theater or in film, is actually a subset of literature rather than a subset of film or art or theater. And then the broader question is, how many people as a society, how many people really read in general? So if there are fewer readers of books, will there be therefore fewer readers of art criticism, theater criticism, or film criticism if we are not attuned to being readers as a society in the first place? And I think it really starts there. What film reviews did, and I think they adapted to internet far better than the others did, and I have a feeling that the others will also come on board sooner or later, is to become deeply entertaining as a craft of its own. So if you check out some of the videos that some of these guys put out, and they went to video, which is no different from writing. I'm just reading something I wrote, and then there's some intonation involved and some element of play acting too, because it's visual. And like say a Roger Ebert, for instance, I mean, he's well known as well known as a movie star is, not because his reviews, and of course his reviews are fantastic, don't get me wrong, he still remains my favorite film critic ever, but because he came on television. And the moment you come on television, there is a tendency for society to believe this guy must be saying something of some worth. We look up to things as in a celebrity culture. We look up to people we see on TV, we see on the big screen. I think that the star system of the film critic that happened with cinema, I would like to see that in a very, and I know I sound very coarse and crass about it, but I'd like to see that in making stars out of the art critics and the theater critics. Why am I interested in your opinion? Because suddenly I believe that you're a star. Now, it's not important what you say, it's important who you are. To a lot of lay readers, that's really what they go for. Even if you look at, say, Twitter, which is a reading medium, but the ones who get the maximum number of hits are people who are quote unquote people who appear on screen, right? I mean, even our prime minister is really big because he appears on screen all the time. He's a star in a very screen sort of way. So I think somewhere there is a need, and I think publication, the media can do it, is to create stars out of voices as voices of authority on why I should go to this person rather than anybody else. And I see that in the internet of now. I did not see that in the internet of before, which I think was pretty much an extension of the publication that existed then. So like a Readers of the world were essentially trying to replicate what a newspaper does. I think what's happening now with the internet is if you are a huge, say a fan of stand-up comedy, then there is a site which only reports on stand-up comedy. So then that becomes a voice of authority on stand-up comedy as against stand-up comedy as a beat in the Hindu. for instance, or any other publication, or in Reader, whatever. I don't know whether Hindu will have stand-up comedies a beat, but that's another matter. So, so I think that those spaces need to eventually will become, I think it will go further and further into niches online, because we've been through the basic larger structure of a replication of a regular publication model. I think the greater niche you are, that's where, so now I want to know about theater. I think there is scope now from compared to the past, where that particular place that only does theater and does it so well is the place I go to.
So, Gayatri, I mean, he makes the point about stars and the internet and repackaging, how you present it. But, I mean, people of my generation, at least, who lived, say, in England for a few years, you grew up reading Michael Billington. He was a star. And, you were led by him when we watched theater. So is it that we lack stars earlier, or is it that the game has changed because of the mediums have changed to some extent, which is the point that Mayank makes?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think the attitude towards the critic has definitely changed. I grew up reading Nissim Ezekiel, Eunice D'Souza. You could go abroad, you could see Michael Fried sitting on a stage and describing one painting by Velázquez, and there'd be a light on the painting and there'd be a light on Michael Fried, and it's intensely theatrical, tickets have been sold, and it's one critic talking about one painting. The other art historian I've seen who has a similar kind of response in India is B.N. Goswami. There's a rich oratorial style, there's a wonderful image projection, the stage is in semi-darkness, and there is certainly a star system behind him in a certain sense, because he's such a valued figure in the field. I think the devaluation has happened at many levels. If we consider, say, the history of art, Abanindranath Tagore is going to be celebrated for 150th year anniversary very soon. Definitely in Bengal, we got a note from Tapati Guha Thakurta. He was a commentator, he was also a pedagogue, he was also a researcher, he wrote on the arts. Ravi Shankar Rawal in Gujarat, that would have been the early 1900s. Ravi Shankar Rawal in 1920 sets up his own, he's a painter, he sets up his own magazine of criticism called Kumar. Ghulam Muhammad Sheikh sets up Vrishchik. Jagdish Swaminathan sets up Contra. What I'm trying to say is, K.G. Subramaniam writes the most authoritative books of his time. What I'm trying to say is that the space is easily cannibalized by artists or existing people in that firmament of stars, so to speak, who write with great authority. And all of this pushes the critic a little further down the lane. Now, one of the experiences we've had on Critical Collective, so Critical Collective, Ananda is an initiative I started 5 years ago, and we have 3 disciplines on it. We have art history, we have cinema, we have modern and contemporary art. And we find that we don't have to turn to critics only. Who we're really turning to now are academics, because look at the influx of study in these areas. So visual culture, visual studies, cultural studies, art history, of course, these have become the areas which are sort of leapt forward, even as things like art criticism look more dated, more late 20th century. So we just brought out a film issue on horror films and that genre. Who are the writers? They're all pedagogues sitting in film study programs in the United States or somewhere in Mumbai or Delhi. And they are looking at Bollywood with intense seriousness. It's this entire space of the liberal arts has been sort of consumed by more and more academic programs, more and more academic researchers. And here then the critic tends to look like free-floating, a little more lightweight, not academic enough, not placed heavily enough. I agree with Mayank that unless you give the critic that kind of space, and Mayank, you have to, I think what would be the question over here is what comes riding on the back of the critic if you give him so much space or give her so much space? What are the capacities, or what are the categories, or what are the, and this is something that Mukund, you as the editor can well answer. What can be enabled? And this, a film studies program in the United States will have South Asianists, and they're now into their second generation or something, and they're really the kind of people. So we had essays on Priyanka Chopra turning 40, and it's a very serious academic essay on what does it do to make a transnational star. And this is studied within the domain of film studies. Are our critics also being given these kinds of opportunities? I'm not quite sure. So this now is in the space of the digital, and one can read this.
Sure, absolutely.
Just about this particular phenomenon that you are referring to, Gayatri. I mean, there is also I was an academic, and I would actually resist academic criticism in terms of criticism of, let's say, theater or the arts, because I mean, they're so jargon inflated. Half the time, I cannot make out what one sentence actually means to say or wants to say. And very often academics, you understand that I'm obviously generalizing. There are many who can write brilliantly to the lay reader, but more often than not, academic scholarship is a different thing altogether. And the critic is in between the lay response and the much more highfalutin academic response. And that's the role that should not collapse under this at all. So, I mean, that's just my response to what you mentioned about academic studies. They're there. They're always going to be there. And kudos to all the books that do come out, but they should not replace the critic.
They should not replace the critic. In a way, the critic is still the reviewer. The critic is still the first response. The first response on the ground. As one, in the 80s or the 90s, you saw the play and went back to the Express and banged it out on the type.
Yeah.
You had the integrity, you had the swiftness of your thought. You put it together, you were given the space, and on the next typewriter was another critic banging out his review of what he'd seen. Of course, an academic critic doesn't do that, or an academic writer doesn't do that. They have a more discursive, a more receding position, which may take years. So we don't replace one with the other. But what I'm trying to say is that they're very active in this space, and the critic then sort of literally is forced into another kind of liminality of finding their own space.
Mukund,
so right. I mean, I just want to ask a question of critics and answers, if you like, how this should influence the reviews. I mean, it's possible to be an arts critic and prefer, say, abstract art over representational art, prefer, surrealism over some other school or whatever. You could be a book reviewer and prefer magic realism over, say, realism. Marquez over someone like Raymond Carver, for instance. So I imagine when it comes to theater as well, people carry their own intellectual baggage when they come to the review and in any other space. And I think it's relevant to ask whether, as a critic, you must keep these under wraps and have as open a mind as possible, particularly in the performance arts, and try and see whatever that is performed in context. Evaluate what is performed against what you believe those who are performing it have set out to perform. In short, you need to ignore your own taste buds a little, discard, at least momentarily, your palate. I just wonder whether you think that is relevant. And Gayatri, do you want to take that, or Mayank? Whoever wants to come in first. Mayank, all right.
So, okay, a couple of things here. One, I do believe, and I'd love it if everyone else could weigh in on this as well. I find one of the challenges of theater criticism per se, or difficulty, if you may call it that, is language. Something that cinema seems to resolve quite easily, in the sense that most of us pretty much in India are bilingual at the least. So let's say if there's somebody who is critiquing or has been critiquing Gujarati theater over a period of time, their access to Kannada theater might well be zero, and or for that matter, somebody who's doing Kannada theatre and has been following it deeply, their access to Bengali theatre may be again zero. I don't know which in the case of, say, when you get into this subtitling space in cinema or even dubbing space for mainstream audiences does not exist. So a film critic's exposure to Iranian cinema, to Turkish cinema, to Bengali cinema, to of all languages is almost it's almost a given that you will have that level exposure. So I think that could be an issue that I think theater does face in terms of a theater critic, in terms of how much they've really taken. I'm sure there are translations, and I mean it purely in terms of performance rather than text. That said, to answer your question, Mukund, I generally feel any critic in any form has to have a really wide palette to a point that becomes your qualification to be a critic in the first place. I mean, I would rather judge someone for their exposure levels and the fact that they simply cannot take. It's like if you are a food critic and you're vegetarian, I think there is an issue here. Because, I would, if unless you are a vegetarian food critic, but what does that even mean? Right? Likewise, I think if you just cannot take horror as a genre in films, then there is a slight issue here in terms of how much can you weigh in on a subject, because that's one area that you cannot compromise on, is that you really tried them all. Now, from within that, of course, you'll have your favorites, and say somebody just loves a romantic comedy and that's what they do. They just love it. Will you make that clear? Of course you do. That's the first thing you do. But having said that, I think there's one thing that's common between great works across, I've noticed, and this would be as true for theater as it is for films for sure, is something that is really of great worth defies genre, and they genuinely cross over. So whether or not you're into sci-fi, it's very hard not to be drawn into, say, Blade Runner. There's certain, while you could be a hardcore sci-fi freak, and therefore there's one thing that you are fully into and others may not get into, but then you make that very well known. It's almost like a disclaimer, a caveat that you put out because you really are a freak of that genre. By itself, I think you need to have the love for the medium and the art form rather than just be a geek or one small element of it. I think it would be restrictive if you were so badly blown away by only one aspect and not into so much else within that medium.
Right. So what you're essentially saying is, yes, it's inevitable that critics would have their preferences and bias, but you need to have a broad enough mind to be willing to see, everything with a sort of dispassionate eye, if you like. I guess there'll be agreement on that, Ananda? Or?
Yeah, entirely. I agree with that. Obviously, the ideal critic should be as unbiased as possible and remove their personal preferences. On saying that, at the same time, I must acknowledge that as an individual critic, I would prefer something that genuinely speaks to us to change the world. And that's very often something that I place right at the top of my priorities. Where is the change element in this particular play or production? At the same time, I've given 5-star reviews to straight out entertaining slapstick like Sharma and Joshi's, I'm forgetting the name of the last one. It's a spectacular production, but it was brilliantly, it's a little like Michael Frayn's Noises Off. Purely entertaining, very comic, and absolutely hilarious. So you have to have that wide horizon, what Mayank said. Yeah.
So, a question, since all of you are engaged in sorry. Yeah, go ahead, Gayatri. Yeah.
I work in the related and, in a way, unrelated areas of criticism and curating. And curating for art is actually very close to theatre. There is the understanding of the mise en scène, there is the understanding of the production, there is the understanding of reception, there is the understanding of annotating works as the eyeball bounces off one to the other, and how do you create meaning? Because if you give 20 paintings to 6 curators and say make a show, you will have 6 different shows with the same 20 paintings simply because of the relationships and the spatial usages that they have allowed from that work. And this is something that theater teaches you. Theater teaches you the value of the object in space and how it can have an affective presence. So in that sense, I think theater is really a mother discipline because it feeds into cinema, it feeds into art with great power. The curator is also closer to an auteur in a certain sense because he or she follows sometimes the making of the exhibition as in a production from its very initial stages. And there is a sort of a shared journey towards its culmination and then the great unveiling. So the unveiling of the exhibition for the curator is very much like an opening night. So there is a great and just the relationships that are built up with the object, the maker of the object, the audience, and the text that you produce are very close to theater. Whereas the critic actually is the one that comes in from the outside. It's where there are many famous critics like Holland Cotter, for instance, who will famously never go for an opening night. They're only likely to slink in when there's hardly anybody in the gallery, look around and write maybe a blazing review, which takes up all 8 columns of the paper. And this is the difference between the two disciplines is quite remarkable. Because one is an attitude of withholding in a certain sense of the personal, of what we were just talking about, your sense of what do you subdue from the palate or not. You withhold the entire personality perhaps in a way that makes it less visible and not directly participatory in any aspect of the exhibition. But then your comment goes out. And I think the thing that one has learned to take away from both of these is what do we value in this? And for me personally, the greatest value has been the value of the archive. Particularly in India at a time when, like, say, the 40s, 50s, and the 60s and the 70s, where great books were not coming out, where publications were very, very few, artist commentaries, etc., were very thin little catalogs sometimes. But these are turned out to be a gold mine of information for the reading of trends. Where do you read early feminism? How do you read, the particular trajectory an artist has followed, and where do we locate certain tendencies? I think the critic did this for us. And I'm sure this is equally true for theater and cinema. And the value of the archive, the value of storage, of documentation cannot be overemphasized. And if the newspaper continues to hold its archives or continues to still give some space, then that would at least be one big thing. Because I don't know what's going to, with the ephemera of the great net, I mean, how long will blogs be floating in the stratosphere, etc.? Where will the archives go? How are you going to put the database together, metadatabase? Indian theatre in the 20th century, how are you going to put that database together is very important.
Yeah, Ananda, you want to say something?
I'm glad that Gayatri raised this because that is actually one of the great plus points of the net, which is the ability it has to grant visibility to all those lost archives. And again, it's unfortunate that while this is happening, archiving and open access on the net is happening in Europe and America. It is not happening in India. And therefore, we still have to run to newspaper libraries, which is a fascinating experience in its own right. But when one can get it online, that's the fastest. And I would really appeal to people who have generous funds that they set up something like this that consists of a theater archive. I'm doing that with my own reviews in a website that I've launched, kolkatatheatre.com, which will go back to the mid-1980s. So, those are all, no one can get it unless you go into a newspaper office library and they'll immediately tell you, go away, or it costs 1,000 rupees, right? I know a particular newspaper group that charges a huge amount of to make a copy of one particular column from going back to maybe 40 or 50 years back. But this should be common public domain information. So this absolutely, Gayatri, is correct. This needs to be done. MumbaiTheatreGuide.com has its own archive of reviews that that's been existing ever since they started. But I would like, once again, institutions like the Sangeet Natak Academy, they have lots of funds, they should do this. They should get young researchers to collect all these and scan them and put them up. It's so easy.
Right. I'm just going to wheel back a little bit. I think, Gayatri, you just referred briefly to this notion of how critics actually engage with performance and, whether they hold themselves back. And I think which raises the question of whether critics watch or perforce have to watch theatre in a way that is very different from the way the audience watches it, for instance. Like, while as a member of the audience, I can lose myself totally, laugh, weep, allow myself to be moved, the theatre critic has to maintain some kind of distance between his own immediate feelings and what is unfolding before him or her. So there is a sense in which critics, and I find myself doing that when I have to read a piece of literary fiction, or I have to review it, that you have to dispassionately, and constantly sometimes, check whether a set of boxes are being ticked. Does this break new ground? Is the humor derivative? Is the play original? Is it cliched, and so on? So is that something of a shared experience when you watch theatre or a film? Mayank, you want to take that?
Sure. Just quickly, Mukund, before I forget, because it was playing in my mind, for audiences to know, and because we're talking about art right now and stuff to sample, there is, lo and behold, this lovely film of Werner Herzog, which essentially talks about, unless you have it in physical form, you may actually lose it all. So films that are actually in film form and newspapers that are in newspaper form is still safe. Internet is not as safe as we assume it to be going into the future, in terms of we could actually all lose all of this. So it might be, as a society, we need to also look
can you explain why? I don't get it.
The preservation of it in the way it is right now, which is in the clouds, is not as foolproof as when you have, say, a can of reels lying in a film archive. There is the fear.
But I'd imagine a can or a newspaper can actually get burnt and destroyed, whereas
it can still be preserved.
Exists in multiple servers across the world is not.
But that's what the film is about. So I don't want to spend too much time on it. But
okay,
there's a real and present danger of stuff that's actually kept into the future. I'm talking about in the future, say 100 years from now, 200 years from now, because we do have films preserved from before that. To answer your question, Mukund, it would be terrible. I think it would be tragic if there was a theatre critic or a film critic who saw themselves as over the audience watching something and were all this serious thing and, like taking notes, as against seeing it for the visceral experience that this art form is. I think you have to lose yourself in that moment. And it comes from practice over many, many years where yes, what you do intellectualize it, but that is a post-fact analysis, not while you're watching. I think that's the beauty of some of these art forms. They just sway you. And if they haven't, and if you're thinking about what your first line of the review is going to be, it already is not working for you. It comes from the love where, unlike, say, reading, I think with books, I find myself, slowing down and sort of taking it in as a review that's being written alongside when I'm reading a book. It doesn't happen so much to me when I'm watching a play or when I'm watching. I think about it much after. And that's also, I think, one of the reasons why this criticism is actually a lot more fun for people, because they're engaging with it almost simultaneously. It's a collective assault on your senses. You watched it in a theater with a whole lot of people, and why would we not feed off each other?
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. It might operate in a slightly different way when you read a book or when you're in theater. But when you're in theater, there's an audience, and you might find that 99% of the audience love it, and they're breaking into peals of laughter, and that can be infectious. And it's still valid to ask whether you should just be caught up in that infection,
or it could be the reverse,
or whether you should be looking at this in a slightly more detached manner. Ananda, do you want to take that?
Yeah, actually, from my experience, it works both ways. Sometimes, as you rightly put it, something that the entire audience is loving, I hate I hate more simply because they are loving it more. I mean, how crass is this? That's what I'm thinking. On the other hand, you have to also let yourself flow. I mean, you are, like Mayank has said, you are part of a collective audience which won't exist the next time the same play is put on. And that also does, in fact, affect your responses. Subconsciously, it's feeding into your responses too. And there's another side of the audience experience, which all of us who have been to an auditorium will realize, is that some of us have often looked at the theatre critic, who we know by face, obviously, and we say that, hey, there he's going off to sleep once again. Gayatri might remember that we have this famous theatre critic of The Statesman, Dharani Ghosh.
Yes.
And he was a legend. And he used to sometimes doze off. And oops, I mean, everybody's looking at him rather than the play, which means actually perhaps the play is a failure. But the greater excitement is in Dharanida has fallen asleep.
Yeah, but which brings me, I think, to my final question. I just toss it to the three of you before we take audience questions, which is, theatre is such a small milieu. Everyone knows everyone else, and you're writing possibly about someone you know in some way or have met before in some way. And it's true of some of the other arts. It's also, as Mayank briefly alluded, I mean, if you are a journalist, then you are, meeting directors, actors, so as well, apart from being a critic. So how does this actually influence a review? How does it influence its tonality? How frank can you be? Do you alter the review on the basis of who might get hurt, how much they might get hurt? So, I mean, at the end of the day, does this undermine one of the basic qualities you expect from a critic, which is a sort of searing, uncompromised honesty? And I'd like you all to answer that honesty. Have any of you pulled your punches because you knew somebody? And it's not a bad thing to do it. I mean, you might believe that it's not great to hurt somebody in print. That's a fair point. But yeah, Ananda.
Yeah, I've often thought about this, Mukund, and I know all other critics have. It's a compromised situation that we are all in, aren't we? Because, like you say, many of us know these directors, actors personally, and that performance or that production tonight has been terrible. They've given better. They will give better. What can you do? What do you write? Of course, the critic must be honest. But at the same time, if a critic is a party-going animal, if the critic likes to socialize, if the critic is an extrovert, I would think that be careful, because the ideal critic should be introverted, should walk in and walk out virtually invisible, not socialize too much with the group, because then only would you be able to be honest and retain the integrity, which allows you, without, of course, descending to abuse, to use parliamentary language and say that this is a terrible production. I expected better from Satyajit Ray. And that's happened. I mean, there are people who have done that because they are, true to that credo of the theatre critic or the art critic that they have to uphold. Do you pull your punches? Yes, sometimes one tends to then fall back on irony, Mukund.
Oh, you do? Okay.
And the clever readers realize what exactly you are trying to say.
Right. Anyone else wants to do that? Take that question.
Well, I guess it's an occupational hazard, Mukund, and this would be an occupational hazard for every journalist, regardless of which area they report on, and whether you could, and at every level, a journalist is also taking those calls in terms of there is an element of critique involved in every news report as well, regardless of what that story is. impossible to keep a check on it. What you can do is consciously avoid reviewing works of people you've become way too close to. And I think if you become way too close to too many people, then just leave the field. It really doesn't belong to you. Because the only thing you're being paid for is honesty. And if you're going to screw around with that, then what's the point? I think by and large, the way I've tried to handle it is, while extremely social, I stay away from the part of town where movies are made. So it's not like I meet them everywhere I go, and I don't have to have coffee with them unless it's an interview that we have sort of slotted. Try not to fraternize way too much, not more than necessary. And when I know that this person is actually a friend of mine, then that's it. Even if I were to write a piece, there would be the customary bracket on a disclaimer, close friend. Now it's up to the reader, because once you lose the reader, once you lose that credibility, then there's no point. I think you should just stop doing it. It's all those years of work, and then there's one friend who screwed it up for you. It's not worth it.
Yeah. So when I worked as an editor and a journalist, I mean, these were some of the questions I struggled with. I mean, when you have someone review, how invested is that person in the space? To try and find a reviewer who's outside that space in some way, I think becomes very important. But I've noticed another thing as well, and I don't know if this is a peculiarly Indian phenomenon or not, that if you achieve a certain status, it could be in film, it could be in it could be in classical music. In Chennai, it's particularly Carnatic music, or dance, Bharatanatyam dance. It could be in theatre as well. The criticism kind of dries up. Very, very few people are willing to go out and tell it like it is. And I could be wrong. This could be my opinion, but I think I'm not always wrong, because I've seen this happen more
holy
than
cows,
once,
basically.
Yeah, they are holy cows, and
Right.
people just don't want to touch them. And I think that's a reflection of maybe not of individual critics particularly, but of the place and the strength of critics I think as a community in this space. I don't see this happening in the West as much as it happens here.
I wanted to say something about this, Mukund. I think there are the question that we talked about earlier. We've been talking a lot about the critic and the audience, the critic and her integrity, the critic and the exhibitionary space or the theatrical event. But what about the newspaper and the critic relationship, or the organ that's bringing out the work and the critic relationship? And I think that need not be one of, it's not a blank canvas that you can come in and write what you
Yeah,
like.
I agree.
There have been instances of art critics who've been sacked because they gave a powerful artist a bad review, and the newspaper will side with the powerful artist. The newspaper will also tell the critic, the secretary's wife is a very good artist. She's a Bharatanatyam dancer, but she's also a painter. Please go and review her show. I mean, unless the newspaper avoids this kind of terrible intervention, the critic does a lot of selection by deciding perhaps not to review, or deciding not to do this or that or the other. So that in itself is a form of position taking. And unless the newspaper allows the freedom of the critic to encourage her own integrity, then there is a problem.
Yeah, I don't want to split hairs. I mean, I take that point. I think what you're saying is true, but I don't think that's the only reason. I mean, I can think back of myself. I've had complaints from all kinds of people who are powerful, people who are settled, and we've stood by the critic. Very often, I've had one actor said, "I want this person sacked," and I said, "Sorry, I mean, you don't do things like this." So, I'm not sure it's entirely a newspaper issue. I think newspapers probably are culpable. I grasp that. But I think it's also got to do with the larger environment. And I think, Ananda.
I mean, to answer your question directly, if it's a big name, I go out of my way to be more critical.
Okay.
And if it's an unknown, I actually encourage them. I go softer. I've noticed that with my own reviews. because it's something that I believe that if you are a big name, then you have something to give us that we expect that's much more. If you're not delivering, then you better watch it, because the critic is going to be after you.
All right. Anyone wants the last word on this?
Well, I completely agree with Ananda. I think this is also one. I think all these problems get solved when the moment you bring in some crowdsourcing opinion on these subjects. Anyway, all the holy cows that we've had in the past, in terms of public figures, have all been taken to the cleaners online. That's because the people were really genuinely tired of the level of worship that the mainstream media had been following around a lot of people who were totally untouchables, and because of various reasons, only one of them being the critic, also the environment, the ecosystem, the whole corporate structure, etc., etc. But I think the one important note here, and where I agree with Ananda, is, and maybe some of it is subconscious and some of it is conscious. We started with talking about how the space is getting limited, at least in mainstream legacy media, in terms of the space that you give for, say, a theater review. And we saw that happening. I've been an editor for newspaper for a while now, and we saw this happening over a period of time. And then one thing I realized was that then the role of the critic, or the post-internet critic, as you might like to term them, it changes a lot, because when the space is so limited, are you really going to call attention to something that nobody's heard of, and they say this is such a piece of shit? What's the point? What purpose did you serve? So and I don't mean in terms of PR puff, but if it becomes then, the role then becomes serendipity, then I'm calling attention to something because there's just way too much stuff around anyway. And I call attention to this thing that you must catch, which you would have not heard of, but this is brilliant. This is amazing, and that you should certainly have as your weekend thing to do, whether it's a play or a film to watch, because you would have not heard of this movie otherwise. Then it's actually a very constructive purpose that a critic brings in to their writing, as against trashing something that. But where you cannot help is if something's too mainstream. It's the event of the week. Is this big movie star? Is this big theater doyen who's massive production? Now, it doesn't matter if it's crap. You have to give space and call it crap, because it's just too big. It's just too upon us. So I think that's the rule to follow by and large. Is I think you're serving a purpose if you're discovering something for the audience, because there's just too much material out there, especially online, in terms of films for sure. Or if you're then taking on the holy cows, because hey man, like they're holy cows, we deserve better from them, we expect more from them.
I think I've just got a message to turn it over to questions, so I'll just read out the questions that we have. First question is from Sanjeev Chopra, and this is to the panel, so and if you can take this. It says Mumbai still has some theatre coverage and criticism in mainstream media, while in Delhi there's none. Lesser circulated but more culture-oriented papers such as the Indian Express and the Hindu try to do their part, but there are no real theatre critics in Delhi anymore. In the 90s, and then this is a comment he makes also, in the 90s and 80s and 90s, Delhi, the fact that the then critic Kavita Nagpal was covering your play was a big hype. Thereafter, 9 out of 10 chances she would blast the play, and if she did appreciate the performance, and most of Delhi wanted to see it. That was the power of the theatre critic then. Anyone wants to take that?
Yeah, I think it goes back to the point I was making to you, Mukund. Unless you invest in your critic and, of course, have full 100% trust on them, and you create stars out of them. He remembers Kavita Nagpal from the 90s. So do I. Distinctly, I remember her because there was an anchor piece in the Times of India, if I'm not mistaken, or was it the Hindustan Times, where the director had kicked her out from the audience. Because I think it was Amir Raza Hussain, and it was a Legend of Ram being staged. And she was in the audience and she was asked to leave. And that is a good enough front page anchor story to do, because you're giving the power is something you invest. Of course, a lot of the power online also comes from the number of followers you have and stuff like that. But you know that is a very fickle, that works in a very fickle space. But And publication needs to empower. And I think one of the things that you'll see, and we've seen this in the discussion, there are so many critics who've been named from Guardian or for the British publications and the American publications, but we don't name that many from Indians because I don't think the newspapers or the publications empowered them as much as they should have. But it's never too late. I think it's going to happen now. It's already happening in the film space. I feel with all kinds of results. There are all kinds of weirdos who are they can just switch on the camera and just say rubbish, and they get lots of followers. But why am I listening to you? Because you also have a personality, and you become a friend, and I know what you like because I've been reading you over a period of time. I think that relationship needs to be established.
Okay, so the second question, well, shouldn't be for me, but he says it's for Mr. Padmanabhan. And the question is, in which kind of journalism, especially when it comes to reviews in English in India, do you come across witticism and irony? So I'll just be brief. I just say, just by respond that the point I was trying to make is not that there's a lot of witticism and irony in reviews in India. It's just that witticism and irony is, when it's wrapped up in criticism, and you're being, ironic in a critical way, then people are, get far more upset than you do when you're just saying it in plain vanilla language. And I found this over and over again, and I'll just give you an example. I think we had a food reviewer who wrote of a steak in a restaurant that it tasted, and I'm only paraphrasing her, but it tasted like a Hawaii rubber chapel left out in the sun too long or something like that. I think, the point was that it was rubbery and not steak-like at all. And I had, representatives of the restaurant come and they were just so upset. It looked as if you were making fun. And I think this is an Indian thing. I found this over and over again. To say that I didn't like it, people are okay. But if you're going to wrap it in use satire and irony and all of that in your reviews, then people get very, very upset because you think you're laughing at them. So that was the basic point I was trying to make. Question 3 is to Mayank from Anuba Fatehpuria. Refer Mr. Mayank's point of dedicated portal criticism of respective art forms is wonderful, but then should they also offer critics proficiency for readers to go through to understand how informed the critics are? Mention that, also talk about, this is not very clear. So I think the question is whether critics and their proficiency should also be made public to people.
I don't know. I think the proof would be, I'm presuming, in the pudding, and people will read over a period of time and judge for themselves whether they feel the person is proficient enough at what they're doing. Don't think you can have, there is no CV for these things in a real sense any more than validation from the readers per se. That's pretty much it, isn't it? I mean, you don't need a degree to be a filmmaker. Why should you need a degree to be a film critic in that sense? But you need to be really, and whether you know your stuff will become clear when somebody reads your stuff. I mean, there's no getting away from that.
Correct. Yeah, I think you're right. I think Michael Billington had very little experience in the theatre before he started reviews. I think he was a public liaison officer for a theatre group or a hall or something for a couple of years, and then he got into reviewing, and he became the biggest theatre critic in Britain. I think still the best in many ways that Britain has ever had. But yeah, Ananda.
No, I do think that there should be a certain level of proficiency required of the theatre critic to be. In terms of that person should know something about the art of theatre. So if not, I mean, again, it's an ideal world, isn't it? If not actually having worked in theatre, then certainly should have some knowledge of it, even if it's academic. That comes without saying. Otherwise, you will not be able to review a Shakespeare play or a Tagore play or Kalidasa or Brecht or Beckett without actually knowing what kinds of theatres these people had been, the context in which they created it. It's not fair. So yes, that kind of proficiency is required. But beyond that, of course, you cannot have part of the byline as, this person has got such and such degree or is proficient in every column. It has to happen before you actually take on a theatre critic.
Sorry, I think the electricity failed at my place.
That's a nice view, Mukund.
I'm trying to call up the chat, which is a bit of a problem on the phone. So if somebody else can go through a couple of other questions, I'd be grateful on chat. Ananda, do you want to pull them up, or?
I don't have.
I think there's just two more questions.
Mukund, they won't be on the other chat, but let me, while they sort of pop up on your screen again, let me just quickly, I wanted to make a couple of comments. So when we first actually thought of doing this, we wanted to do a whole series around criticism and the need for criticism. And one of the primary reasons for that is, of course, one is the larger who reads it, the celebrity critic, as Mayank talked about, the critic who must be behind the scenes, etc. But the idea really was that the need for criticism is to evolve the art form. And today the problem is that the art form itself, because it doesn't have good criticism, which is considered, which is thought through, you're not getting that kind of quality of being able to think through your own art, because you got into this. It's more the publicity wagon that you've got into rather than the need and the desire to be able to improve your own art. And I'm going to pick up a couple of things. Mayank talked about how people like Kavita Nagpal. Well, unfortunately, in India, we don't read history and we don't record stuff. So whether it's on Amitabh Malik or Uma Vasudevan or all of the great critics of not so long ago, you're just talking 30, 35 years ago, even those have disappeared. Amitabh Malik could make or break a television program. She could make or break, and she did some of the most brilliant conversations, whether it was with Ray or Kurosawa or etc. Absolutely amazing. But it's just disappeared because All India Radio and Doordarshan erased, deleted, by mistake, much of the archives of that point of time. And that sort of, led to the complete negation of the power of the critic and the importance of the critic. I remember when I got my first Amitabh Malik and Kavita Nagpal review, it was like, it didn't matter what it said. It was like, oh my God, they reviewed you. That was the aspect. And then you learn from them because it was considered, and it didn't matter to them that they knew you or didn't know you, like you were saying. And Ananda, unfortunately, you were talking about Sangeet Natak Academy and the need to be able to, get people together to be able to archive some stuff. So IGNCA was given this particular role to document and archive, as you know. Unfortunately, in this year and last year, IGNCA's budget was cut from 11 to 7 to 8 to 5 and to this year to 3 crores for its entire year's budget. So it's very important archive, which it was doing a fairly good job given the limitations of money that it had, and the amount that it had to archive has mostly come to a standstill. And as far as Sangeet Natak Academy goes, they haven't, unfortunately, over the last 2 decades, been able to update their archives. And I don't know whether you know, but their budget has been cut by 75% in the first quarter because apparently, there's been no arts activity. So it's okay to cut the arts budget. So there is a larger issue there in terms of archiving, etc. But just going back for another second to the need for criticism, as Mayank said, and each of you have said, we feel it's absolutely vital to have a space, commentary, dialogue, discussion, debate, disagreement. I've received a criticism from Rana Siddiqui Zaman, who I think was with The Hindu, who questioned why we have this particular panel talking about theatre. And I had to explain that we were talking about criticism. We were talking about the need for critics. It wasn't about A discipline or B discipline. and the fact that, you know, her criticism was none of you really in recent times been a theater critic. I again want to put this into consideration that criticism, irrespective of the art form, is all conjoined. And as I think Gayatri said a little while ago before I think she's just fallen off the chat. She said theater in many ways is the mother source, connected, interconnected with film, with the visual arts, with music, and with everything else. And we know that how can you be a theater critic without necessarily knowing your music? How can you be your music critic without knowing the background to everything that's musical in the Carnatic or the North Indian classical tradition, etc.? So these are pretty much all conjoined. And I do hope, I mean, I'm certainly making this commitment to you and to all our viewers that for a while we've been trying to get a platform going, and I hope Mukund in his post-retirement mode will take this comment and perhaps run with it, is the need to have, as Mayank said, a platform for the arts, a platform for criticism. It can be both crowdsourced so that you can have people coming in and posting their comments, but also must have considered educated criticism, which will help the arts move forward. And I think on that happy note, just a very warm and big thank you, Ananda Lal, Mayank, Shekhar, Gayatri, Sinha, Mukund, Padmanabhan, from all of us at Meta. Say hi to him. Hi.
Say hi.
Hi. The best part of this. And over to you, Suraj, and I hope you all will also join us for the release of the first publication we're going to do from Meta, which is now we've decided that every award-winning best play original script will be published by us, so it becomes part of an archive. And we will send that free of cost to libraries, etc., across, so that again, we're able to build a discipline of writing and recording. So thank you all. Suraj, over to you.
Thank you, Sanjoy. Thank you, Gayatri ji, Ananda ji, Mayank, for such an incredible conversation. And thank you, Mukund, for being a fantastic moderator. We're really sorry that Deepa Gahlot couldn't join the conversation because of technical issues. Deepa, we missed you terribly. With you, the conversation would have been even more richer. But let's have you on the panel soon. But once again, we'd like to thank Mahindra Group for their support to the arts. We'd also like to thank Mini and Windy Banga Family Trust for supporting the Theatre Critics Conference. And thank you all for being such a wonderful audience. We hope you all enjoyed this conversation and conference today. We'll log back on for our next event to be held on the 18th of August at 5 p.m., which is the launch of our, as Sanjoy mentioned, launch of the first ever published edition of the Meta Best Original Script. And in case any of you have missed out on any of the sessions from today, you can watch it in the archives of our YouTube channel or Facebook page with the name of Mahindra Excellence in Theatre Awards. On behalf of Jay, Sanjay, Ankur, Judith, Purnika, and my other colleagues at Meta Secretariat, I would like to thank you all once again. Have a good evening.
Thank you.